Hey friends, welcome to another wonderful edition of the INFP Creative. I want to talk about the glory days for INFP and, by extension, INFJ and other intuitive feeling creatives. And that is the era I came up in, which was the 1990s. I was born in 77, same year Star Wars came out, Elvis died. My teen years and my early 20s were this wonderful decade set in between the fall of communism and 9/11, where it was just like, I don't want to say perfect peace, but it was a really interesting time called the 1990s. This is a decade that began seeing the Berlin Wall come down, then the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a decade that saw O.J. Simpson, Jerry Springer, and all sorts of other kind of trash TV, the dawn of reality TV. We still loved MTV to a point. There was liquid television, the first forays into adult animation. Certainly The Simpsons starting at the end of the 80s, but really coming to full force in the 90s. And of course, you had the music of Nirvana, Radiohead, the rave and grunge movements, the singer-songwriter types like Fiona Apple and Elliott Smith, television shows, Twin Peaks, The X-Files, with leads who were intuitive feeling males. I think about the 90s a lot because, those ages between like 14 and 21 really define who you are, kind of like the rest of your life. Why was INFPism in the air? Why was it such a good era for, people who are idealistic and questing and maybe a little too fragile to withstand some of the other harsher realities that other decades had, and that sort of like reinforced, certainly in men, more macho or capitalist competitive types. And so here's my reasons why I think the 90s were such a mecca for the INFP creative type. Number one, we were coming off of the Vietnam War. My dad was in it, and America did not win the Vietnam War, and they did not treat their veterans very well. And in general, the shift between having a military that was made up of drafted people into something that people signed up for changed what you thought you could be or do as a male. And I'm the first of, I think, all of my family members to not join the military and have militarism rubbed into me. In fact, because I grew up in the 80s and the 90s and we weren't fighting a lot and we didn't really process Vietnam that well, except through, Oliver Stone's touchy-feely movies. I never had militarism as like an option for me or a thing I wanted to do or thought about. What did come about in the 80s on the creative end were people like George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, and ultimately people like Peter Jackson followed after, Guillermo del Toro followed after them, and certainly David Lynch was in the ether. These filmmakers were exploring idealism without and the subconscious, and utilizing special effects that allowed dreams to be made real. Because before, you could have dreams and you could draw them like Jack Kirby, but they weren't mass media dreams. The reason why Star Wars can exist or Lord of the Rings can exist as films is because technology made that stuff look real and feel real, and the protagonists of those films, Luke Skywalker, Frodo, are INFP males, and they could explore this fantasy world. That's when we started getting like good Spider-Man movies, in the early 2000s. People tried before and they failed, and the stories weren't good. Well, we can be honest about that, but even if the stories were good, the effects weren't good enough to support a good story. So the requirement of a fantasy or sci-fi world, these kind of imaginative, dreamy worlds that INFPs thrive in, it just didn't exist. So people were less militaristic. We had less reason to be militaristic too. Of course, the Cold War ending just like made everybody so the horizon seemed to broaden so much. It's very hard to describe that to somebody. Those horizons that were broadened and people wanted to be like connecting internationally through this new thing called the internet, that all collapsed with 9/11, and all of a sudden, internationalism seems scary, and conservatism and isolationism seemed the way to be, to refine your identity. But in the 90s, it wasn't like that. It was very colorful, and people wanted to travel across the world, and they wanted to talk to other people with this thing called the internet. I got my first girlfriend, through the internet, somebody international. It was new horizons left and right. We could achieve our dreams in media in ways we hadn't before. And then I think, culturally, there's always a reaction to what comes before, right? And if you look at the 80s, not just militarism, but Reaganomics, greed, Wall Street, materialism, capitalism, that was interesting to people in that era. But all eras fade and shift, and so you get a reaction to that, and that is the non-materialistic. That is the emphasis on authenticity. And, the paragon for that would be Kurt Cobain, of course. And I remember being a freshman in high school in 1991 when Smells Like Teen Spirit got really big. You saw all these kind of preppy and jock types in school. Like overnight, they started smoking pot, and they started wearing flannel, and they started hanging out with people that they called, dirts before, or picking on them. But all of a sudden, it's like, oh, there might be something to this. Now, it's helpful that Kurt Cobain was a screamer and played loud music, because, prior to him, there was punk rock, but the most visible proponents of screaming and being loud were people like Axl Rose and Motley Crue, and that was just not quite the same as a guy that wrote these songs in his bedroom and found a way to elevate them to a very dynamic level. The other musicians of the era who are like huge INFP icons, you've got Jeff Buckley, you got Fiona Apple. One could argue that Tori Amos is a INFJ, but to me, INFJ, INFP things, they're very, very similar. They're intuitive feelers and very, kind of stay away from the spotlight. They're not big entertainers. The characters of Fox Mulder and Dale Cooper, he's a little more of an INFJ, but I think it's so funny to think of them today as the protagonists of TV shows. They're FBI agents, they're law enforcement, but they are believers in mysticism and aliens, techniques like drilling a hole in your head to elevate your consciousness. I mean, what came after the 90s, you ask? Well, along with 9/11 came boy bands and reality TV, which just really cranked up inauthenticity and materialism to great heights, of course. Britney Spears, TV shows that borrowed from The Simpsons, but kind of took it in more crass, obnoxious, less soulful ways, like Family Guy. You had this emphasis on being performative. I remember the music industry, when the album sales collapsed due to file sharing, the big thing they told musicians then is, well, you just got to be a great performer and sell tickets. So, guess what kind of music we got? Things that leaned on being performative and not things that were about expressing feelings and communicating, connecting with somebody through a record or a CD or a tape that you bought. These things move in cycles, the contrast to Dale Cooper and Fox Mulder, you got somebody like Jack Bauer from 24 who openly advocated for torturing people. And it's so funny, like, the things that show up in pop culture are really just a reflection of what's going on with everything else, the stew at the time. If intelligent, insightful, searching, material defined certainly the first half of the 1990s, you know, for INFPs and creative people, you think that's a utopia, but nothing lasts, right? There's no way to sustain this homeostasis of a perfect world, and it's so unfortunate because a lot of those INFP creatives of that era check themselves out. You've got Elliott Smith, Kurt Cobain, obviously. They fell under excess, so I haven't mentioned Johnny Depp yet, but he was somebody who could do no wrong, especially when he did things like Edward Scissorhands, you know, maybe one of the most INFP movies of all time. Winona Ryder, like they just couldn't keep up with the demands. And then when you get to the early 2000s, even people who are pretty solid, like a David Lynch, they move on to other things. You know, the INFP creative is a questing creative, and they can't stay in this row of doing whatever it is they're doing for very long. They need to expand and change and retreat and be hermit-like for periods of time. Now, I made this video because part of INFPism and creativism is sort of understanding what you like, why you feel the way you feel, you know, what's the roots of those things. And we live in an incredibly conservative era right now. I mean, the rise of MAGA as being a mainstream thing, as absurd as it seems to me, and unempathetic and not particularly thoughtful and materialistic as MAGAism is, I've lived through enough eras to know that this too shall pass. Everything passes. It comes around. You just got to survive it, and you got to, as an artist, be willing to reflect it in a way that you feel is authentic. So a lot of the artworks I'll be making, I'm sure in the next 4 years, will be reflecting this era we live in and how I feel about it and how I respond to it. If you're an INFP or INFJ creative out there, I hope you feel the same too. Best of luck in your own creative endeavors. Talk to you next time.